So now I'd like to just introduce, if to anyone who is not doesn't know or isn't familiar, Amy Grace Wells is a senior content designer at 10up. She's been designing interfaces, building taxonomies, finding content solutions since 2005. She's designed e-commerce solutions for Birdwatchers Digest, served as an expert on content strategy and information architecture for multiple state agencies in Texas. Worked on Department of Defense projects that serve military families. And at 10up, she works with clients from Fortune 100 to higher education to design great experiences. And Amy's going to speak with us tonight about supporting neurodiversity and cognitive accessibility in our work and our team. So please welcome Amy.
All right, thank you. Let's see, I'm gonna share my screen here, get it all set up for us. So bear with me for just a second. All right. All right, so so this is a topic that is very dear to my heart because, yes, hi, I'm Amy and I have ADHD. My journey is becoming more and more common. I was diagnosed when I was 35 years old, and mainly because I was in treatment and seeing a therapist for anxiety, which is very common, little comorbidity to have, especially when you're neurodivergent. And we just started to notice this pattern where I was like, my brain's just not working. My stress goes up, my anxiety goes up, and I just can't focus. I can't think. So that really led me to my diagnosis. And ever since then, just about to turn 40 here soon. And ever since I got my diagnosis, I've just been on this path of learning as much as I can about how my brain works, how other people's work that are on the neurodivergent spectrum. And it's just been really just a passion of mine to kind of share my experiences and what I've learned along the way. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I want to talk about it kind of in two ways. And so first is the way about how we can put cognitive accessibility and inclusive design into the work that we do. And then I also want to talk about how we can work with each other better and make some accommodations and make the workspace more neurodivergent friendly. So, I think the first thing that we have to talk about is the fact that, inclusive design, it really requires supporting these variations in cognition. And inclusive design, of course, goes beyond accessibility. I talk about cognitive accessibility a little bit, but it really is incorporating all of that kind of inclusive design, because there are a lot of accessibility standards. If you're going for WCAG AA standard or something like that, there are a lot of requirements that do meet the needs and help people with different cognitive accessibility needs. But there's also just not a lot there yet. I know that these are things that they're working on, but there's a lot of things that we can do in our work that not only make things actually usable for people with different cognitive needs, but easier for everybody. And one of the big things here is that we're just trying to remove barriers for people whose disabilities affect how they process information. And sometimes when I have conversations with people, when I use the word disability in relation to ADHD, that's not always considered a disability. It's not always considered oh, yeah, I see that as a disability, the same way you might see a vision impairment, or you might see, some other visible disability. But for me, ADHD is a disability, and I actually receive ADA accommodations at work for it. And it's not saying that everybody who has a neurodivergent condition is disabled. And there's some people who do identify as having superpowers. But ultimately for me, and for a lot of people that I know, the kind of superpowers that we talk about often don't make up for the disabling factors of the conditions. So I want to unpack the neurodivergent spectrum just a little bit so that we can all kind of know what we're talking about and kind of the most common conditions that kind of make up that spectrum. So first of all, what is neurodivergence in general? This is a term that has been used and designed to kind of just explain natural variations in the human brain. And the big key word there is natural. So this is not, ADHD is not something you get because you ate too much candy in childhood. It's not something you outgrow. It's not like, it can be affected by your diet and things like that, but it's not something caused. It's literally how your brain is wired. Particularly for something like ADHD, basically my brain can't take up as much dopamine as other people's brains. Like I just don't have as many dopamine receptors. So I literally just can't get enough of a neurotransmitter. Like that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about natural. Like there are physiological things happening. So these are not conditions of behavior or willpower. These are physical differences in how we're built and how our brains are put together. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with our brain. So when we're talking about these variations, like we're talking about things that affect every area of our life. So how we think, how we learn, how we manage our mood, how we regulate our emotions, how we are able to regulate our attention, how we interact in social situations, and a lot of other mental functions that are particularly focused in the prefrontal cortex, so that front part of your brain. And when you look at this and you think about all of these things and just like going through your day, how all of these things are affected every single day. And so I often talk about when I'm sharing a lot of my experiences, and I know this is true for a lot of neurodivergent people that I talk to, like being neurodivergent in a mostly neurotypical world is really exhausting. My normal is basically to live on the knife edge of being overwhelmed. And so one tiny little thing can really push me over the edge. I was recently just traveling and speaking at another conference on this topic, and like trying to plan that travel and take that travel. And I took my 9-month-old with me too. Like I have been living in a state of overwhelm for probably about 3 weeks. And it's like, okay, I need to make sure I'm taking care of myself because I always live on that knife edge. And if I push a little too hard, I can fall over it. And so it's just really just exhausting on a daily basis sometimes to kind of be aware of how I'm moving through the world and how I need to adjust to a lot of the people around me. So when we're looking at the neurodivergent spectrum, I've talked a lot about ADHD because that's the condition that affects me, but typically kind of these are the big four. These are not the only neurodivergent conditions, but these are a lot of the big four. So we're talking about ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a really actually terrible name for what the condition is. Autism, dyspraxia, and dyslexia. So just walking through, a lot of you are probably somewhat familiar with most of these. But ADHD, again, like I said, that's actually a really awful name for it. There was a TikToker who found a better name that I think explains it a lot better. And that is dopamine attention variability executive dysfunction. And so again, I talked about that neurotransmitter. That's all about dopamine. And it's not that we have a lack of attention. It's that we have a really hard time regulating our attention. So if you think about some of the stereotypes with ADHD, where it's like, oh, squirrel, and like we're over here now, that's because we have a hard time regulating that attention, and we're kind of following the dopamine trail. When we look at autism, that, definitely affects the ability to communicate and interact. It impacts the nervous system. So again, there's a really physical reason that is invisible to others. Common difficulties that people with autism face on a daily basis include communication, social interactions, obsessive interests, and repetitive behaviors. And as we talk about a lot of these things, you're going to start to see that a lot of the issues that are very common. And there's even an interesting conversation happening right now on, is ADHD and autism separate conditions, or are they just opposite ends of the spectrum for one condition? Because there's a lot of things that overlap. Dyspraxia, I think that's one of the ones that maybe not as many people know about, but that's actually a developmental coordination disorder. So problems with movement, judgment, processing, memory. It also affects the body's immune system and nervous system. So again, there's some themes here. Oftentimes persons with dyspraxia finds it difficult to plan what to do and how to do it. Dyslexia is, again, one of those that is probably more commonly known, and people mainly know it because having difficulty with reading or how they process language. But it also can be like they can have trouble understanding jokes or things like idioms. So something like a piece of cake. Somebody with dyslexia might not be able to process that and understand the idiom and kind of the slang behind it. Now, I add a note down here because this spectrum includes a lot of additional conditions, and it's kind of continually being redefined as more and more is known. So, some people consider bipolar on the neurodivergent spectrum, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's some other conditions, but so just know that it's not hard defined at this point. But there is a lot of things that kind of overlap as we're looking at what is most common as far as experiences. So, when we're looking at the spectrum, the statistic that I have seen research on is that when you add up all these conditions, it could be that 20% of your users may be neurodiverse. And, when I saw that, I'm like, wow, that is not an edge case. Neurodiversity, that's the big thing here. Neurodiversity is not an edge case. 20%, something that affects 20% of your customers, of your visitors, of your users is not an edge case. And I think that, anybody who's really interested in inclusive design and accessibility is always like, well, we need to design for those edge cases, but this isn't that. And so, anything that affects 20% is a big deal. I also always, and I have been starting to talk about this more because I run the employee resource group at 10 Up for neurodivergent people who identify as neurodivergents. And I don't require a diagnosis to join. And there's a reason for that. We are a global company. And the way that a lot of these conditions are looked at in different countries can be very different. And access to diagnosis may be very limited. And so, inclusion should not require a diagnosis. If we're designing for inclusion, if we're designing for everybody, we should not be kind of requiring that diagnosis for any type of admission to access. And I talk a lot to higher ed groups because the first half of my career was in that. And so this is a big part of what I talk about, because when we think about disability in higher ed, yes, if you're actually asking for accommodation, it's very formalized in that way, but that doesn't mean that that how we design the websites and everything else should require that. So let's say, we've kind of done a real brief and overview of kind of what neurodivergence is and just kind of a little primer. But let's say, hey, I want to create a neurodiverse friendly experience. Where do I even start? And the first thing really is understanding that our brains may not physically be able to match the requirements. Again, these are not conditions of behavior. These are not conditions of moral failings. These are not conditions of willpower. These are literal neurotransmitters. These are chemicals. And so our brains may not be able to physically match the requirements that you set out. So and I already talked about this a little bit, but again, like we often have some superpowers in some areas and deficits in other particularly key areas. And sometimes those deficits don't actually like override our superpowers. So as I start to talk about, I'm going to talk about kind of 6 areas to really think about when you're designing. And then we're going to talk about those 6 areas, both again, in how we work with each other. And one disclaimer is I'm going to share a lot of personal experiences, and that does not mean that they are in any way everybody's experiences. And everybody on the spectrum is going to experience neurodivergence differently. So just keep that in mind as we talk here. So first of all, the first and foremost place to start is lowering cognitive load and use of memory. So this is the foundation of creating inclusive, neurodiverse friendly experiences. Many design patterns, many digital tasks require a lot of high cognitive load or working memory to be able to remember information from previous steps or different channels, like getting a code from your email, like all of that. And so one way that I kind of talk about cognitive load is, have you ever thought about how many steps it takes to take a shower? I have. There are probably about 20 different steps in taking a shower. And for me, I have to think about every single one. And there are a lot of days where taking a shower just takes too much cognitive load for me. I don't have that extra bandwidth because, you know, I have to decide to go upstairs. I have to go in my house. First step, I have to go upstairs. Then I have to turn on the shower because, you know, the water's got to warm up. It's upstairs. It's really got to, you know, I have an old house. Then, you know, I have to check the temperature, got to get the temperature right. Then, like, you know, I have to undress. I have to make sure I have a towel. I have to then shower. And then in showering, I have to wash my hair. I have to wash my body. I put conditioner on my hair. I wash my face. Like, all those things are individual tasks that I have to think about in order to take a shower. And it's interesting because my spouse is also on the neurodivergent spectrum, but kind of on the opposite end from me. And I asked him about this one time, and he's like, well, I just take a shower. Like, and I'm like, yeah, that's not how I take a shower. And so, you know, if you think about me doing this in the morning, that's taking a lot of my cognitive energy away right at the beginning. I am definitely looking at, like, I've been kind of looking into how I can reduce the number of decisions I have to make a day, because, you know, it's just a lot for me. And then when we talk about like memory, so one of the reasons we're talking about memory is because a lot of people with neurodivergence have limited working memory. And working memory is a very specific type. So you have your short-term memory, you have your long-term memory, but you also have your working memory. And the best way to understand working memory is to think about, if I sent you to the grocery store, how many, without a list, how many things, what number could you remember? Is it 5? Is it 6? Is it 2? That is your working memory. So being able to kind of hold it, what information can you hold, like usable, I need to remember this to do something memory. Most people with neurodivergence don't have as many spaces in that. So if you could normally remember, you know, 5 things to go to the store, we might be able to remember 2 or 3. So we just have a few less spaces there. And this comes into things like having to remember anything from a previous step, or having to remember something like remembering a discount code that was in an email. Like, oh gosh, somebody cannot give me a full phone number. I can't do it. I can't even remember a 6-digit code from my email. I have to do the first 3 numbers for a security 2-factor thing. I have to remember the first 3 numbers, and then I have to go back and look at the email or the text again to remember the second 3 numbers, because I can't hold that full 6-digit code in my memory at one time. So it's those types of things that we have to start thinking about. Can we write at a lower grade level to lower that cognitive load? Can we fight the good fight and remove any type of extra content that really isn't serving the task? Next, we look at complexity. How can we reduce complexity? So as technology advances, it does not always equate to simplicity. Like, I completely understand the need for security, and I love two-factor authentication. I want everything to be really secure, but it's also really frustrating and really difficult for a lot of like neurodiverse users. And there's one client who uses like Google Authenticator or something like that. And for some reason, the push notifications have never worked for our team. I don't know why. So I actually have to unlock my phone. I have to unlock my phone. I have to find the app. I have to find the code. And inevitably, I have to add 15 minutes to that login task because I end up on TikTok, because I have a difficulty regulating my attention and I want dopamine, and TikTok is dopamine for me. It is just pure, like, oh, I love it. But I don't love it when I'm trying to actually get work done and remembering to log into something. There's also our HR system does not follow a common pattern of like you log in. Normally it's like, all right, I already sent you the email or I already sent you the text, get this code. No. You have to click the button. It's like, okay, you need this code. Click this button to have it sent. And so I sit there for 5 minutes because I always forget that I have to click the button because it's not a common pattern. So when we're looking at things like this, like how can we just like take some of that complexity out? Where are the other places that, you know, we can just make things a little bit easier? And why we do this is we do have a lot of difficulty with like task initiation. And so the more complex something appears or seems in our brain, the more like we're going to struggle with task initiation. And, you know, even something as simple as right versus left, I have to consciously think about which way is right and which way is left. I know which way is right and left, but I have to think about it. And so it just adds, again, it's just adding more and more onto that cognitive load. I am a military spouse, so I have moved a lot. I have bought and sold houses, you know, 3 or 4 times now. So like this last time we worked with a mortgage company that had a portal where it told me exactly what I needed to upload, and it made a check mark beside it when it was done. And it would like add things to it as more things were added. Like as the mortgage underwriters decided they wanted this document, it would add it to the list. That was amazing because I actually had an updating list that was not in my notebook, not lost on a Post-it note, not lost in the mail or my email. Good Lord, if you send me an email, like, Paula, I am sorry, I'm horrible at email because I see it, but I don't reply right then, and then it's gone. Poof, boom, gone. But like, you know, being able to add required documents in a list form, in a place that's easy to get back to. Bonus if it can be. I mean, I know downloads are, you know, we don't want everything in PDF. We want things, you know, that's great. But if you can also provide a way to download that checklist so that I can have it in my hand is great. When you're looking at complexity, does your search require accurate spelling, or do you support fuzzy spelling? You know, when you're thinking about users with dyslexia or just, you know, any other type of neurodivergence, like, are you requiring accurate spelling, or is there a way that we can make sure we're supporting people who may struggle with that? So those are all kind of ways that we can start to reduce some of that complexity that's required of the user. Eliminating time challenges. And sometimes it may seem intuitive that limiting the time actually helps people focus on it because they know they have a short amount of time to it. But this also plays into one we're going to talk about emotional regulation also. And like many neurodiverse users may need to take breaks or complete steps at different times to be able to be successful. I love traveling, but I get really overwhelmed with travel planning. And so I have to like start researching where I want to stay or where I want to go, because I'll see like one bad review and I have to like, I get overwhelmed and I have to stop. So this is like, I have to come back into it. I have to do it in short little bursts where I'm like planning and researching options and things like that, because I can't handle, I get very overwhelmed and then I just can't, my brain stops. I can't make any more decisions. I've run out of dopamine. I've run out of neurotransmitters to actually be able to do things. So anytime that we can provide some flexibility, most of the systems out there nowadays, like particularly if it's a multi-step, a task, oftentimes you can save things and save and exit and come back to it later. Bonus points to anybody who can get the engineers to then like send an email to that person saying, hey, would you like to pick up where you left off? Click this and it'll take you right to where you left off. I mean, how much that can't take that much more work. We already send emails to people to remind them of their shopping carts or anything else. So like, why can't we do something like that? One reason I love Slack is because they'll send you the magic link so you don't have to remember the password and things like that. So like allowing people to do things in multiple steps over time is really, really great. Another thing that a lot of neurodivergent people deal with is time blindness. I know this affects me a lot in ADHD and a lot of people that I've talked with. So it happens in two different ways. One, if we get really into something, if we are excited, if that dopamine is flowing, we can all of a sudden 2 hours can be gone and it felt like minutes because it was just enjoyable and our brain was humming and it was great. But it also works the opposite way. If you really hate mowing the lawn and you're going to think that mowing the lawn takes all day, you're going to think, oh, I don't want to do this. I can't get started on this because like this is my whole day gone. When actually it may take you 20 minutes. And this is a common recommendation for a lot of people, particularly with ADHD or other neurodivergence, like set a timer and actually do the thing with a timer running. So you can actually get an accurate representation of how long it took so that it's easier to start the next time. But sometimes our brains just have absolutely no concept of time. Like, I mean, post-pandemic, I'm not sure time has a meaning anyways. Excuse me. But let me grab a cough drop real quick. Sorry about that. Those Kentucky allergies keep creeping up on me. But yeah, like, I mean, time doesn't mean much to any of us anymore post-pandemic, but particularly for people with neurodivergence, it just has no meaning whatsoever. So just know that like we may not have an accurate representation of how long something's going to take. So if you can include that, like, hey, on average, this form takes 5 minutes to fill out. That's great. We do that on surveys. Let's do it in more places. Yeah. All right. So the fourth principle here is as far as focusing attention and removing distractions. So here's the classic ADHD part of it. But this, again, also falls into a lot of the other conditions that have any difficulty regulating or any difficulty with sensory or anything like that can really cause distractions. So, oftentimes we're pulled in multiple directions, especially on the web or just in our daily lives. It was even interesting after I had my baby, my daycare didn't start for a while. And, it's one of those things like we're all disabled temporarily at different times. And it might be that, when I had to work and hold my baby, I started using accessibility tools for dictation and for tools that would be used for people who were maybe missing an arm or a hand, or maybe didn't have mobility in a hand. And that was a temporary disability for me because I couldn't use my arm because I had to hold my baby. And a lot of this is the same too. Like anything that you do that helps neurodivergent people can help all of your other users. So when we're pulled in multiple directions, it can be really hard to focus that attention. And these challenges can be really disabling for neurodivergent users. And it really comes down, like I said, I don't have a lack of attention. I have a difficulty regulating my attention. So, some things that we can do with our designs here are things like tooltips. Tooltips everywhere. They're so easy to add. There's such a little bit of content, like tooltips everywhere, just to help me understand what I'm doing, understand any context, making sure that any type of related content or content interrupters are in the right experiences. So if it's an experience that is really built on discoverability, maybe that content interrupter is a great idea, because maybe your user has gotten the gist of whatever blog or whatever it is that they've read, and they want to jump to something new. That's great. Now, if you are trying to get somebody to complete a task and you're putting something like, hey, come look at this afterwards, like, let's say it's a higher ed and let's say it's like apply for graduation. And right below that submit button, you already have a big old ad for order your cap and gown. How many people who are neurodiverse are going to skip over the submit button and go straight to the order the cap and gown? So think about the context and think about, like, is that person completing a task? Don't interrupt them. Keep really simple layouts. This one is I always have some really interesting conversations after I make this recommendation. But bolding. I know so many organizations that love to bold the keywords because they think it actually makes it easier to like scan and read. It actually makes it harder to read. And you also think about if you have somebody who already has difficulty processing letters and language, that just ups the complexity, it ups the cognitive load, and it makes things harder to read. Bullets, subheads, those are all great, but I try to avoid, and I try to recommend people avoiding using bolding for keywords within a paragraph of content because it can make it hard to read. And anybody who has heard David Dillon talk knows that if it's hard to read, it's hard to do.
Amy, are you meant to be on a slide that shows, oh, I'm sorry. I'm just one.
Oh, you're okay. You're all right.
Go ahead, please.
Yep. Yeah. So what we want to do is help aid task completion. So, executive dysfunction, it's sometimes just fascinating. So all these functions are a key area for challenge for neurodiverse spectrum. And it includes many things, again, like I said, with that prefrontal cortex, and particularly affects task completion. So making sure that we're not distracting people is really important. We also, when I talked about the travel planning and things like that, we also get a lot of analysis paralysis. And so that happens to me a lot as well, where like I can't make a decision. So anything that we can do to kind of help with that task completion, provide context or helper text, make calls to action very clear and unmistakable, explain what will happen after completing an action, just adding in that expectation setting can really help make the difference between getting something done and abandoning it. Finally, remember emotion. So one thing that's pretty common across the neurodivergent spectrum is both sensory issues and emotional regulation issues. And it was really interesting. Once I finally got my ADHD diagnosis, I realized I wasn't having panic attacks, what I thought were panic attacks. I was having sensory overload issues that mimic panic attacks. And everything is emotional. Everything is emotional. And, many of the previous design patterns that I've talked about can contribute to emotional overload. And it's the same thing as like analysis paralysis. It's the same thing as, a lot of things that can just make us stop in our tracks. And just really a lot of these things cannot be detached from emotion. So when we're thinking about that emotional dysregulation, definitely think about those success or those feedback messages for tasks, making sure like that those tool tips really help users avoid mistakes so that we don't have that frustration. Like error messages are great. We all know how to do good error messages, but can we do more before the error message to help people just avoid that and not even hit that frustration? Like I said at the beginning, I'm always kind of managing a state of overwhelm. I'm always like right there. And so, it can just be really difficult. Any one little thing in my day can really push me over the edge. So it's just something to think about. And overall, this all talks about the ultimate theme of executive dysfunction. But I also want to talk about, so looking at this overall, these are kind of the 6 areas that I've talked about. I also want to talk about how we can make our work more inclusive by using these. So if we go through these, pull them up one more time, there are a lot of things that we can do in our just like daily teams in how we run meetings and what we expect from people and how we communicate that can really help our neurodiverse colleagues be really successful. So looking at cognitive load and memory, first of all, transcripts, live captioning, that can be really huge for a lot of neurodiverse people because, again, think about difficulty regulating attention. Sometimes I zone out, I hear something, somebody says something. I like to describe my brain as a spiderweb brain. ADHD brains are very tangential. They're not very linear. They're like a big old spider web and everything connects to everything else. And so somebody might say something and I might think about something from 10 years ago. And all of a sudden I've lost 30 seconds in the meeting. If I have that Zoom transcript going, I can scroll back up real quick. I can catch back up and it doesn't, then, if I'm asked a question, I'm not like, oh crap. So that's something I don't know about Teams. I'm more of a Zoom user, but most of the platforms support this now. And so it's something that's really easy and can make meetings a lot more inclusive. Making sure that you have somebody designated as a note taker and making sure that everything is in writing. So even though I know I don't have good working memory, that doesn't mean I always remember to take notes. Why that is, I don't know. You would think that knowing I don't have good working memory, I would take really good notes. But sometimes I'm just like, I'm so invested in the conversation that, that hyper focus goes on and I don't take notes. And then I'm like, crap. So making sure that like somebody is designated as a note taker and provides those notes later. If you do anything in like a ticketing system, Basecamp, Teamwork, Jira, whatever it is, making sure that those tickets have context that has everything in writing. There's clear instructions. There's clear task requirements. There's clear, like, people understand what success looks like for something. And then documentation. I think this is something that often, like internal documentation is often something that kind of gets put to the wayside, but making sure that if you have a secure place for server credentials or like what is the staging server? What's the production server? Because it can be, I can bookmark the heck out of everything, but do you think I bookmark everything because I can't remember it. So do you think I can then go back and find that bookmark? Knowing that like we can struggle with organization and things like that because we save a lot of things because we can't remember it, making sure that if you have control over documentation, that it's good and easy to find, which takes us to complexity. Again, easy to find documentation and all the documentation. It just helps us. If we have something we can go back to reference, to remind ourselves, to make sure that helps us focus, that is really, really great. Anytime that we can do some collaborative design. In my company, you know, I work at an agency, and oftentimes there's been times where I was the only designer on maybe a small retainer or a small project. Oftentimes I'm the one content designer along with a UX designer and a visual designer. So one of my go-tos for when I'm solutioning or trying to understand or process design problems, things that we've heard from the client, I send a message to the UX designer. I'm like, hey, you want to have like a 1 hour workshop? Like, can we just like talk through this? Because there's probably something I've forgotten that they remember, and just being able to process it with another person helps me like get through things and kind of get it focused. Take that spider web and make it a little smaller so I can see what needs to be done. Making sure people have access to visual tools. I know that Miro, Figma, whatever it is, like Miro, sometimes when I cannot start a task because for some reason I'm facing a wall of awful and maybe it's not clear what I need to do. Maybe I can't visualize what the end result needs to be. I will set a time. I'll set a timer. I have a timer like this that is very visual, that shows me the little wedge. I love it. It's on my desk all the time. And I will set that, open up a Miro board, and just put stickies for what I know and what I don't know. And usually that is enough to help me get through that wall of awful and get started on something. But if I don't have that, I could sit here for an entire day. I could sit here for an entire 8 hours and go, I want to do the thing. I want to do the thing. Let's do the thing. But I won't be able to start it. I just physically won't. When we're looking at time challenges, think about how you consider deadlines. So this doesn't mean moving out the final deadline. It doesn't mean not having deadlines, but could you have mini deadlines? Like, could you have, of course, so the amazing thing is I can get 8 hours of work done in 2 hours right before a deadline. That's how I got through 2 graduate programs. It's ridiculous. I don't know how I did it. But a lot of people with ADHD thrive under that urgency. Like, that's why we always wrote our papers at the last minute, our term papers in college or things like that. So by I desperately want to split things up and do things over several days. And I'm going to do a little today, a little tomorrow. Like, all right, what happens? I wait until I need some dopamine, and you get no dopamine from urgency or novelty. And so I wait until the last minute when that urgency kicks in and I get the dopamine and I do it all. By helping your colleagues, if you know they're neurodiverse, maybe making kind of mini deadlines and setting a meeting and saying, hey, we're going to have a 15-minute check-in. I just want to see how this part of the project is going. That can really help a neurodiverse colleague kind of make that incremental progress. Make sure you provide processing time. So again, I work in agency. I think this is kind of common among agencies, but they're kind of an expectation that you're good on the fly. You're good on the spot. Like, if a client asks you a question, you can just go off on a string that way. I'm not always good at that. I need time to sink in. I hated participation points in college in participation grades, because I was the person that just needed to sit back, listen, process everything coming in. And then towards the end of class, I would make 1 or 2 comments that were really synthesizing and took into account a lot of the conversation, but I wasn't the person leading the conversation. So make sure that there's some processing time. Say, hey, if it's a morning meeting, say, hey, can you let me know this afternoon? If it's an afternoon meeting, say, hey, could you let me know by lunch tomorrow? Try and allow processing time if that's possible. Again, like I said, break up those tasks. Anytime, we can break things into smaller and smaller pieces. Oftentimes, a lot of us can do that very well for ourselves, but there's a lot of times we need help with that as well. And so just being able to do that, if you have the ability, if you are in like a leadership position or, whatever it is, helping people break up tasks. Respecting time blocks. And I'm going to talk about this in the next one as well. But, if we have time blocked out on our calendar for something, try and respect that. I always have like a please ask before booking. And most people, like my company is really great about like, if it's really needed for a client meeting or a big group meeting, I get it. I'm not going to tell you no. But I really appreciate you asking, because at least I can understand why that meeting is being set. Now, if it's a one-on-one, I might ask like, hey, can we really push this to another time? Because I've set this time aside for like no distractions. And then think about flexible schedules as well. I think in the post-pandemic world, a lot of us are supportive of this. But I do really incredible work from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. That doesn't mean I like to work from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. But like, there's no distractions. My brain can focus so easily. It doesn't take me a lot of effort to focus from 10 to 2 a.m. So, just knowing that sometimes people are at their best at different times that are outside of the 9 to 5. When we look at attention and distraction, thinking about that deep work time. So I don't know if anybody in here has like, done a lot of reading or anything on getting into a flow state. And that's where we do a lot of our deep work. We have to get into a flow state to do our deep work. The runway that is needed for neurodiverse people could be a lot longer. We might need the runway of one of those big old, jets that have the double stacked in the bar and the individual pods and like those really big airliners. We need their runway. Whereas a neurotypical person might need the runway of a Cessna. They might just need a little rural runway. We need a big runway. And so making sure if we have time blocked out for that deep work, don't bother us if you can. Totally get it. But if you can, let us have that runway, because it may take us 30 or 40 minutes to get into a task. And once we're there, hyper focus, we're good. But we need that time to get into it. That plays into kind of Slack etiquette. So if I have to send a DM to somebody, almost always it's not urgent, and so I start it with not urgent. I also mute almost every Slack channel. And so I only know that I will look at it a couple times a day. I'll also see if I've been, it'll show up if I have actually been tagged in something, but I cannot handle a bolded Slack channel. I can't resist it. I have to look at it. And so if it is bolded, I have to look at it. It will distract me. So I mute them. So just thinking about like how you're tagging people, whether or not you're using threads versus like just things in the main channel, all of that type of stuff can help with that attention. If you are somebody who is back in an office, 10up is remote. We do not have to deal with this. But if you are somebody who is back in an office, a lot of us work in open offices, making sure there's distraction limiting tools, whether that's headphones or spaces. Make sure it's not hard for them to get a like small room or something where they get away. Because again, that sensory information can really be just tough to deal with some days. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I got just a couple more slides. Task completion and task initiation. Again, going back to making sure those instructions are clear, making sure the task requirements are clear, and that it's documented in a place that they can see. So if that is in a JIRA ticket that is assigned to them, that's great. That's where it needs to be. They can find it easily. Providing low pressure accountability. So one of the things that we do in our employee resource group is we have a daily accountability thread where people can come in and they can say what they want to work on that day. And it's just a way, there's nobody that's coming back to them and being like, did you get that done? You said you were going to do it. Did you get that done? There's nobody there that's going to do that. So, but it's a low pressure accountability. They can set their intention and they know that people have seen it. And that can be enough to help somebody get into task initiation and get something completed. Also allowing people, particularly if you are a manager, allowing people a safe space to struggle. Again, we do this in the ERG. And it's not uncommon to have somebody post like, oh, I'm really struggling to get started with something. I'm really struggling with this. Making sure that people have a safe space to voice that without fear of punishment, because for most of our lives, we have been told that we are not meeting expectations. And so we're really, rejection sensitive dysphoria is really common with a lot of people who have neurodivergent conditions because we've never fit into the neurotypical world. So making sure that we have those spaces, and that also plays into the emotion, making sure that we have those safe spaces to share, understanding that work is emotional. We do, like, this is 8 hours, 9 hours of our day. Like, work is emotional. And again, if you are a manager, watch for that burnout, because it can be particularly tough and particularly hard on people of the neurodivergent spectrum. It's hard for everybody. And I think we're all a little burnout, at this point in the world as it is, but making sure that like you're supporting your people, you're supporting your colleagues, giving them a space to share, and making sure that, they're taking the rest and getting something that, they can find some refresh with. Ultimately, the big thing here is understanding that the problem is not the person. Again, I've said this several times, but neurodivergent conditions are not behavioral problems. They are not willpower problems. They are not moral failings. They are physical conditions that change how we interact with the world. And it's something that, if we have a new person who joins the ERG, I almost always have this conversation where I'm like, it's not you, it's your brain. Stop beating yourself up for not being able to do this. It's not you actually want to do the thing. I hear you saying you want to do the thing. Your brain doesn't have enough chemicals to do the thing. So start shifting that thinking. And that often helps them a lot deal with some of that guilt and shame that comes along with wanting to do the thing, but not being able to. So thank you so much for letting me share about this. I hope we have some really great questions and enough time to get through them.
Yeah, we have a lot of good questions. I got to say, though, Amy, the percentage of stuff in the chat that's related to kind of recognition of what's going on, validation of what you're talking about, appreciation, that percentage is way over the top this time. So thank you. You really inspired a lot of good conversation there. But there were some questions too. So I'll jump ahead. The first one was from Bridget. Let me jump back to that in the chat. Sorry. There's so much chat today. It's a little harder than usual to navigate this. So thanks, everybody. But Bridget asked, she says, I facilitate a lot of workshops, and I notice it takes like 45 to 60 minutes to really get into a flow. But I imagine neurodivergent folks desperately need a break long before that mark. How do we balance the people who are, on a roll with those who need to pause and regroup?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it could even just be allowing, like making sure, setting some expectations at the beginning to say, if anybody here, like if you need to take a 5-minute break, go ahead, leave the room. Like if you need to go get a drink, like letting people regulate themselves, but making sure you set that expectation early so that they know that it is like, that is a real expectation. They don't have to assume that they have to like stay focused. And I mean, a lot of times, when I'm doing workshops and stuff, if one person steps out like for 5 minutes or so, it's not a big deal. The conversation is going to keep going. So I think, one, you're probably already planning good breaks, especially if it's like a big workshop day or something like that. But just allowing people to regulate, allowing them to get up, like making sure that expectation is set as well. If you need to get up and stand back against the wall and, be able to move around, making sure that expectation is set so that they know whatever you need to do to be comfortable and included. Giving, if you have a little budget, if it's an in-person thing, making sure that like, hey, can you get some fidgets? Can you get some stress balls? Can you get like something tactile? I have to, if I'm in a meeting, I've noticed this a lot lately. I'm always reaching for something on my desk, whether it's like a scrap of paper that I can fold or whatever it is. I have to have something tactile in my hand. So any of those things can really just help a neurodiverse user or a neurodiverse colleague be more present and engaged.
Nice. Next question is from Amy. She says, I run a student resource group for neurodivergent students. What are some of your top resources that I can share with the community?
Oh, man. I think CHAD is a great, I think it's CHADD. They have a lot of really great things. I really love the TikToker. This is specific to ADHD, but How to ADHD, Jessica McCabe. She has some really great videos that, like, she has a couple videos on the wall of awful. She has a really great video on like motivation and why it's different for ADHD people, and how it's not, again, it's not that we don't want to do it. It's, you know, where the difference is. There's so many great, like a lot of TikTokers. If you're looking for like accommodation information, Ask Jan has some really great things on accommodations for cognitive accessibility. I mean, really, the biggest thing is just looking for authentic sources. I think that's one of the big things, and just making sure that one of the reasons I love the How to ADHD is because she shares a lot of her personal experiences. And I think that's a big, that's just a big thing that I really connect with.
And one thing I'd say, if folks know of resources and want to drop them in our Slack channel, and we could even, I'm not going to make any promises because I'm not running the website, but we also have resource stuff on the website. We might be able to archive things, but certainly we can get them in the Slack right away. Next question is from Jessie. She asks, are you aware of any research around neurodivergence and saccades and fixations? I have a hunch that neurodivergent folks' eyes move around a page very differently from the way neurotypical folks do.
I don't know of any specific research on that. That would be really fascinating, though. Yeah. Now I want to see somebody do that research, because I think that would be really fascinating.
So let's put the word out to all of our UX research friends, because a lot of them do. I know I actually have a friend who does eye tracking. I'll ask. Ariel had a question. She said she's curious about how you handle those moments of emotional overload that you were talking about at one point. She feels so frustrated when I can't chill out, and I've hit that point. Yeah.
I mean, it can be really difficult, especially like if it's in the middle of a meeting. Like they always come at the most inopportune time. I think for me, I'm particularly self-aware. I'm kind of like almost like hyper vigilant when it comes to like self-awareness. And so oftentimes I know I'll already know if I'm kind of struggling that day a little bit. And so if I know, I often take more breaks those days. I make sure I build in some extra breaks. I always watch for days where maybe I have like 2 to 3 hours of meetings in a row, and I'm like, I'm blocking out the time before that block, and I'm blocking out the time after that block for a long kind of chance to walk away from my desk. Now that often means that I don't get my 8 hours of billable time in during the 9 to 5. And that's something that I'm still struggling with on how to like structure my day to allow myself those breaks that I need. But I think it's something that's just really important in making sure that like you are blocking out time to be able to walk away, to be able to decompress, to whether it's take a walk, whether it's have a cup of tea, whether it's just lay on the bed and stare at the ceiling for 20 minutes and just like, desensitize. Making sure that you're setting boundaries that way so that you are a little bit less like you have more capacity going into a meeting, especially if you know that it might be a little overwhelming.
I just want to observe that between that question and this one, there was a whole great thread in the chat about bookmarks and other ways of dealing with that kind of distraction and focus stuff, and just ways to capture things. So I just want to acknowledge that those are all in there and thank everyone for putting those in. But the next question that came up was, does anyone other than neurodivergent folks prefer written instructions over video? You know, if there's any media preference there.
Well, and I think it just depends. It also depends on the neurodivergent person. Like, I really like written instructions. I like being able to go back to transcripts because I can just do Command F if I know a particular thing that I'm looking for. But I also know a lot of people who they want that visual, like they want the video, they want now usually the one thing with video too, I can't listen to audiobooks on the regular speed. I have to speed it up or I cannot keep my focus. I usually need to listen to something on like 1.5 speed to be able to keep my focus with it. So like it's interesting because I can't make a blanket statement for any one, any condition or any within even one condition. But most people I know, like they want the written instructions so that they can go back to them and remind themselves. Like it's kind of one of those checks. So one of the things with like hyper focus as well is I might only be allowed 4 hours to work on something, but I find it really interesting. And so having those written instructions and that scope and expectations kind of help me go, oh yeah, I can't follow this. I have to pull back. And that helps me manage my time as well.
Cool, thank you. And Sally asks, are there any books you recommend that get into the brain science of neurodivergence, neurodiversity? I love all this and thank you for sharing. She also says.
Yeah. I know there's like one, there's one I've been meaning to read about. I think it's called like Neurodiversity at Work. I don't have a lot of references for actual books, mainly because if I bought them, they would probably sit on my shelf and I would mean to read them, but I would never actually read them. Or I would read I'm really bad at reading the first chapter and then like abandoning it. So I don't lean on books as much, but I'm sure that there are other like ADHD TikTok, neurodiverse TikTok is out there for as long as it's around ADHD and neurodiverse. Twitter is a really great resource. So I would definitely check those out, ask questions in those to see if anybody else has recommendations. I mainly lean more on YouTubers, TikTokers, and then like articles.
Thanks. And the next question is from Pete. Pete says, I'm an adult, an undiagnosed adult with a teenage son who's diagnosed with ASD, autism spectrum disorder. I know that ASD is genetic, so I'm questioning if I have ASD or ADHD, because what I'm hearing from you about your experience with ADHD and work sounds a lot more like me. How do I get diagnosed as an adult?
So first of all, that is a very common way that people as adults get diagnosed, is because they have a child who ends up getting diagnosed, and it is very hereditary. It was even interesting after I got my diagnosis. We've always kind of known my brother was ADHD, but after I got my diagnosis, even my sisters, who, are kind of very different from me and very different from each other as well. They both had conversations with me about like, I think I might have ADHD. And I'm like, I think you might. First of all, like it can be very difficult depending on your insurance, depending on where you live, depending on what access you have. It can be very difficult to get diagnosed. I would say that like one of the big reasons to seek diagnosis is if you do want to try medications, particularly for ADHD, because of course you have to have that diagnosis to get, any type of stimulant medication. But the big thing is you need to get a referral to a clinical psychologist. So you can't just go to a general kind of therapist psychologist. It needs to be a clinical psychologist. Depending on depending on their process, depending on who they work for, it can also vary differently. I've had several people in our ERG who have gotten diagnosis after joining our ERG and kind of, going like, yeah, this actually does sound a lot like me. And for some people, it's really, for me, it was really easy. I'm incredibly, I understand the privilege that I have, and that it was easy for me to get diagnosed, that I went to a clinical psychologist, and I think I filled out a couple forms. They asked me some questions. I think it was about 2 hours, and they were like, yeah, your textbook. One big thing that they're kind of looking for now, since you have a child who has been diagnosed, that's going to be a big, that's already going to be a big thing that they're going to look at, because it is very genetic. I know one thing, particularly with ADHD, one thing that they're always looking at is that they want to see that it has gone back to some point in like your schooling. So like for me, I could start to track things in middle school. I was an honor student in accelerated classes, but I would start to kind of miss assignments here and there. And so I could start to track some things back to middle school. And that's one of the big things they're looking for, is like, when did it start? So if you haven't thought about middle school or elementary school or high school in a long time, start thinking about some of those experiences, and seeing if there's some commonalities between what you struggle with now and what you struggled with then.
Well, thanks. And I just want to point out, there's a lot of good resources and suggestions in the chat too. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to the next question, but you folks might want to grab the chat. There's lots of good stuff in there. But the next question is from Alexandra. Asks, do you have any tips or advice on bringing this up to teams to help fix how we work? I do have some anxiety about telling my team about my ADHD, but even more so that they'll feel that they have to be forced to listen, and that I'm just bringing it up because it's a current topic or trying to change the team for just me.
Yeah. So if you feel like being brave, my experience was that when I joined 10 Up, it was my first full-time job since my diagnosis, because I had a few years with being a military spouse where I was freelancing. And so it was my first full-time job after my diagnosis. And like, I struggled. Like, I was not a great employee for, that first 6 months. And it led me to, get an improvement plan and some things like that. And that's where I got like an ADHD coach. I actually work with an ADHD coach. And for me, I like talking about my experience. And I wanted more people to understand. And so like we had a summit, we had like a little internal summit during the pandemic, and I actually did a talk, like I did a little lightning talk on how my ADHD affects my work and some of the productivity hacks that I use. So for me, this was just something that I was like, I'm going to put out there, and I'm going to put out to everybody, and I'm going to look at it in a very positive way. So I'm not going to frame it as, hey, you all have to do things differently because like, it's hard for me. But I put it out there as like, here's how some ways that like I am successful that may look different than what you do. And that's when I also started, that's when I asked for the private Slack group that actually ended up becoming our employee resource group. So it can be a very vulnerable thing. To kind of lead that charge if you are open to that. But I would also say that like, if there's anybody you can confide in, maybe it's not your direct manager, maybe it's somebody else at the organization. Like, you can always try, one thing that I've told people before is like, you could always just try and be like, hey, like, I want to make sure we're being inclusive. Could we just enable transcripts globally on our Zoom account? Because that's something you can do. You could ask the company like, hey, I just want to make sure we're being inclusive. Could we enable transcripts so that you don't have to call yourself out, but you're calling it out as being inclusive to everybody? I think it's really just with your comfort level and like and bringing it up in a positive way. If it is something where you have a diagnosis and you want an ADA accommodation, talk to your HR people, because that's a whole different kind of conversation. But just frame it as like, hey, I think this could really help some people who maybe process things differently. Could we do this? Or if you block out your calendar, just the people that you work with the most, kind of explain to them and just be like, you know, I'm just so distracted. Like there's a lot of meetings. I'm distracted a lot lately. I want to make sure I'm doing really good work. So I'm going to block out this time. If you really need it for something, like message me ahead of time, let me know. But I'm going to really try to block out distractions during this time. So you don't have to tie it specifically to your diagnosis.
And closely related to that question, I think, should someone with ADHD, or this is Brendan is asking, should someone with ADHD disclose that to their employer or potential employer?
Well, that's hard. And I can't say definitively yes or no, because like every organization is going to be a little different and every situation is going to be different. I think if you work for an organization like that you think that really cares about their employees, I think you're going to generally be safe in disclosing that, and making sure when I started talking to, I've had different team leads in my time at 10up, and so one of the things that I did was, if I ever got a new team lead, I would kind of have a conversation with them. I'm like, hey, look, I have ADHD. I've learned a little bit about how it affects me at work. And I would send them a couple of the How to ADHD videos to help them understand, particularly the wall of awful, particularly the motivation. And I would ask them if they'd watch those. I also did a little read me first document. And I don't use it as much anymore, but when I was working with new project managers, because of course we have at an agency, I work on several different client teams. And so I have different project managers, and I had a little readme that just said like, hey, this is how I work. These are some of the things I struggle with. I know me personally. So one of the big things with me personally is when I get very overwhelmed, I stop communicating. So I would tell them that. I'd be like, hey, if you haven't heard from me, that's probably a good sign that I'm overwhelmed. So like ping me gently and just say, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help? I think it gets particularly difficult when you're talking about potential employers. Like if you're applying for jobs, that's a space I don't know if I can, that is so hard. I think if you are really comfortable with it and you're really comfortable talking about it, I think that's where I would be like, yeah, go ahead and disclose it and be ready to talk to them about that and what it means in the interview. And if they don't bring it up, bring it up. But if you're not ready to talk about it, maybe it's something that you don't bring up until there's a need.
Oh, thanks. Hey, I think that's all the questions we have. There was one more right at the very end. Kelsey left another resource. Said they haven't read the book Neurotribes by Steve Silberman yet, but any opinion or thoughts about that book? Or
I know that my husband has that book. I have not read it. But I know of it, but I have not read it. So I can't speak to it.
Pete just left a comment. He says it's a doorstop at 485 pages. But anyhow, so there is a little bit of quantitative feedback about it in the chat. So yeah. Well, hey, I just want to put out there if anybody, I left a similar note in the chat, but if anybody wants to just raise their hand, we'd be happy to unmute you if you want to elaborate on any questions or comments you had, or and Paula or Ariel, did either of you have anything you wanted to follow up on? Or?
Oh my gosh, I could talk about this forever. No, I think there are so many ways that you could talk about neurodiversity, and Amy, I really appreciate the depth and breadth that you covered this evening, and just really appreciate you bringing this topic to light. Thank you.
I see that Pete has a hand up, and then after Pete, then I'll kind of jump in.
Yeah, Pete, I think you're unmuted, so go ahead.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, just wanted to point out with Silberman's article, his book with Neurotribes, he originally wrote it in Wired. It was an article first before it was the book. So I'm going to try to see if I can get a one-off from Wired, or if I have to subscribe, that's fine. But it may be more worth my time to read that. Because it's a condensed, but yeah, it's good so far. The stories are really long about the whole evolution of it, but it's good. And
if you
also
find that link and it's available, if you could drop it in our, like in one of our social channels, that'd be great.
Come again?
If you find a link and it's shareable, if it's not behind a paywall and could share it, that'd be great. I think other folks would appreciate that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
You bet.
I do see one other question. Jane is asking,
yeah.
When's your book coming out? Amy, are you working on a book?
There might be something in the works. Nothing definitive yet. I might get something definitive by the end of the year, but we'll see. ADHD and writing a book, man, that I don't even know how to do that. But I have done all kinds of other hard things, including getting 2 master's degrees that I didn't need. So who knows?
You just made your first sale in the chat, so you should get to work.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I was talking to a friend last week, and we were talking about that idea of who am I to write a book? And she was like, who are you to not write a book? Quit hogging that information. So I'll just put that out there. Yeah.
I will say I got through like half of the you should write a book from a list apart, and have not gotten back to the second half in classic my ADHD form. So
Well, if the chat here is any indication, you would have some pretty immediate sales and obviously a lot of interest. So with that, I want to thank Amy. She's in Kentucky, so and I know she just got back from overseas travel, so we appreciate her staying up to speak with us. I think obviously such an important conversation, and just to as to kind of re-emphasizing that solving for some of these issues helps everyone, right? So someone pointed out very early in the chat that age affects things like your short-term memory too, and so there are so many ways that just doing the right thing, whether it's for specifically for neurodiverse people, helps us all, and so all of your tips and your suggestions and your experience is so relevant here. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for your great questions. Thanks for your great participation in the chat. And I guess just once again, find us on Slack, find us at contentstrategyseattle.org. Watch for other events. We'd love to see you again.
Thanks all.